The more evidence, the better, I say.
I mean, this is so improbable.
That's a bold statement.
I mean, I think that's a fair point, but I didn't make that argument. He did.
Why is that true? Is that a good question? Maybe it's not.
Drew, you're not supposed to ask good questions like
Sorry,
that. Don't ask difficult questions.
Bill, jump in here.
I'm Bill the Christian.
And I'm Drew the Skeptic.
You're listening to The Divide.
Welcome back to The Divide. I'm Drew. I'm here with Bill, and we have a guest today, Taylor, who is a philosophy professor and a podcaster. Taylor, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me, Drew.
And Taylor, I read an article in the Atlantic the other day.
The Athletic would be
is
great.
for my other podcast. That's for fantasy baseball. But no, the Atlantic said that it was an article by Stephen Cave said there's no such thing as free will. So I really wanted to ask you about this. Is that correct or no?
I think it's not correct, but I'm a philosopher, so I want to clarify and make some distinctions before I just say no. I think lots of people mean different things when they use the term free will. So first question would be, wait, in what sense is Cave claiming that we don't have free will? It's not totally clear from that article in The Atlantic how he thinks of it. He talks about it in different ways throughout the article. So most philosophers now think free will, let's just use that term to pick out whatever kind of control that we would need to have over our behavior to count as morally responsible for it. So if I'm really going to deserve blame for doing something bad, or if I really deserve praise for doing something good, I have to have freely done the thing that I deserve blame or praise for. And in that sense, I do think that we have free will. Now, of course, there are lots of challenges to the idea that we really deserve praise and blame. And some of those come up in the Cave piece, and I thought some of his discussion of those things was good. But on the whole, I disagree that we don't have free will in that sense, and I think that is a real disagreement between me and Cave.
So, would you say that there are levels that you have to define that free will can be on this level or this level or this level? Because when I think of free will, I think of like you said, are we culpable for our actions?
Mm-hmm.
Are we praiseworthy or blameworthy when we act? Or, I mean, certainly no one thinks that, I don't think that anyone thinks that they are a zombie or that we are all zombies and we have, we're just acting machines. But that we feel like we have some choice in what we're doing. But then, a lot of people from different disciplines or meditation, people have gone back and said, well, where are my thoughts coming from, and how did I get to be the person that I am? And it seems like when you trace it back, sometimes it can be like, well, this is just this was inevitable.
Mm-hmm.
You can use the word determined, you can use the word whatever.
Fated.
Yeah, it was meant to be this way. And people obviously have a hard time with that because we just believe in responsibility. But where would you say, sort of on the spectrum of completely, fated to completely free, we are the author of ourselves and of our fate? Can you sort of like put it on a spectrum?
Yeah, I think that's a great way of thinking about it. I don't know what the weaker end of the spectrum would really be. Maybe it is something like just making a choice among apparent options. Maybe it's like doing that, but without being coerced by someone else, right? So if that's
barely free.
Yeah, I think that is like a weaker sense of freedom than what some other people have in mind. Maybe there's even weaker. I don't know what the end of that spectrum is, but yeah, on the other end, you might think something like being the cause of yourself or deciding what kind of character you'll have, but without any sort of, history or input from something external to you, like being the cause of your own existence in that strong sense. And I actually think that sense, even though some people do think of that as connected with the idea of free will, I think that conception of freedom is incoherent. It couldn't even possibly exist that there is this being, certainly not a finite agent like you or me, that could cause their own existence and decide without any sort of influence what their character
So
preferences will
if
be.
I'm hearing you correctly, from almost zombie on one end of the spectrum, it goes to actually freer than God, that we could conceive of a God being on the other end of the spectrum. So this is a pretty interesting spectrum just right off the bat.
Yeah. Well, so the way I think about it, that end of the spectrum, if we're thinking of it as part of the spectrum, it's impossible. So on another way of looking at it, that really shouldn't be on the spectrum, because no being could possibly have that sense of freedom.
Yeah,
it's like a square circle.
It's like, could God create a rock so big
Yeah.
that he can't move it? It's a theoretical impossibility or a paradox.
Right.
It's not really an option, but it is something we can conceive of paradoxically.
Right.
Even if it doesn't make any sense.
I think we're not really conceiving of like a power or a freedom when we describe this agent that causes their own existence. But yeah, we can use terminology to talk about it, just like we can use the language of a square circle, even if we're not really describing something that's possible or, yes, a reality.
So no surprise that this discussion is already sounding highly philosophical. And Drew, you are, I mean, out of the gate. He's like, he is into the philosophy. So let me ask maybe a little simpler question, which is, because the guy that wrote the article seems really confident. And I kind of think I've heard this a lot. This is not just one article somewhere. I hear this a lot out in the sort of public media sphere, that it's just sort of assumed we don't have free will, that the world is a physical mechanism and we're just happen to be here at this stage of history, and it's all just quarks and physics that's ultimately determining what we're doing. And so my question is it that he's just thinking like as an atheist would, or a secular mind would, Drew accepted here, and that they're sort of forced to have to think this way, and that Christians aren't forced that way? Or can both sides be forced to one direction? So what's sort of your take on that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I tend to think it won't really make a difference whether one is a Christian or not, whether one thinks that, that we have free will. I mean, I guess there are special reasons if you think God exists and is going to hold us accountable for what we do, to affirm a pro-free will position. But I don't think that some Christians would disagree with this, but my view is not that, because God has endowed us with a soul or with something that stands over and above the ordinary natural cause and effect sequence of the world, that somehow is how we have free will. So my view of freedom, I think you could give a completely sort of natural account of it. It doesn't require an appeal to miracles or even an immaterial soul. So in that way, so I don't think of free will as just the very weakest form of freedom on our spectrum of just choosing or not being coerced. I think there's more to it than that, somewhere a little bit down the spectrum from that. But I don't think it requires anything like, being the cause of your own existence, and not even something like, having a soul that's outside of the natural causal order.
So that's an interesting point, because I can't really conceive of what freedom would mean if we're just sort of atoms and molecules and quarks. So what exactly do you mean by it? Is there a way, without getting into sort of the science of it, that you can answer that question?
Yeah, wait, let me interrupt just a second, because I want you to answer Drew's question, but I want to know the other side of that. Is that also true on the sort of secular atheist side? Do you think that it's also possible to be over on that side and could understand, there could be two different positions, so to speak? I assume the answer is yes.
I think that's right. So the people that I hear saying, oh, to have free will, we'd have to have a soul or something like that, it tends to be non-philosophers. It tends to be scientists who are skeptical of the idea that we have a soul. And so then they're committed to this idea that we don't have free will because they don't think we have souls. And I mean, it's not like there's no reason for thinking that. It's just most philosophers would say that's neither here nor there when it comes to the control or freedom that we would need to be accountable.
I think I understand what you mean, because I've listened to some of your podcasts, and I can see how on a particular definition, which we're not going to get too far into those, that a lot of the philosophers I'm certain not all religious would say that it's compatible. You know, that you can have even if it's a deterministic world, which is maybe not, you know, you can still have some sense of free will. We never actually let you answer the question. We got the spectrum from you, but we didn't get your point on the spectrum of where you think that you know we actually are.
Yeah.
Which goes back to Drew's first question I interrupted, which I really want to hear the answer to. So let's hear your view of it.
Yeah. So philosophers working on free will now like to distinguish between two conceptions of freedom. One that has to do with sometimes called leeway, being able to choose from among various genuinely available options. So like if you think of free will as being able to do one thing, but also at that very same time being able to do something else instead. That's a kind of leeway conception of freedom. Sometimes people call it the ability to do otherwise or alternative possibilities. And then another conception, which we might call sourcehood in contrast to leeway, just says that for you to be free is for you to be the appropriate source of your behavior. So it really traces to you or to some part of you that makes you accountable for what you're doing. And so my view of freedom is more in this sourcehood view. I don't think that we need to have the ability to do otherwise to be morally responsible for what we do. And yeah, when it comes to like what it is, I'm not going to get into the science because I would be going beyond what I should be saying as a philosopher who's not terribly well informed on the science. But what I think you need to have in order to be free is, well, it needs to be the case that your desires, your beliefs, maybe your intentions appropriately explain what you did. So let's just use a concrete case, right? Suppose that, you know, Bill asked me to be a guest on the Divide podcast, and I'm deliberating, should I do it? Should I not? And suppose that, you know, it's a good podcast and I don't have any good reason not to be on it. It would be blameworthy for me to be, maybe it'd be lazy for me to say no. And so I think the right thing to do is to say yes to be on the podcast. And so I deliberate about it and then I say, yes, yeah, I'll be on the podcast. Am I maybe praiseworthy, or at least am I accountable for that decision? Was it really my decision? Was it up to me? Well, I think yes, if the explanation for why I agreed to be on the podcast was that I believed that it was a good thing to do, I desired to do it. It wasn't like, you know, you know, it wasn't the equivalent of like, you know, a spasm or something like that was totally outside of my control. It was something that I did and I had control over. And I think that's the kind of explanation. Of course, we could get a little bit more fine-grained than that, but I think that's the kind of explanation that I would want to give. And it doesn't make any appeal to whether I could have done otherwise. So maybe it could turn out that I couldn't have done otherwise than agreed. And yet I think I could still be accountable for the choice.
Well, let's talk about that. That is a very interesting point. I think some people would say, well, wait a minute, of course I can do otherwise. And if I can't do otherwise, maybe that is a problem, right? Like if I can't go right or go left, then I don't really have the choice, you know, so how am I free? But you're saying you go right every time because that's who you are and that's how you are, and but you are the one making that decision. So sort of. I mean, I'm being very lazy about the semantics here, but I guess the question is, okay, well, whether it's, let's get a little bit darker and let's say, you know, somebody who commits a crime. We don't have to define.
How about if we say Jeffrey Dahmer?
Yeah. So a bad crime or many bad crimes, you know, I think there are certainly people out there who would say that they don't do that because they wake up one day and say, you know, I want to be a serial killer. There have been cases certainly where, you know, you find in some kind of horrific shooting or something. I'm thinking of one guy at the University of Texas. You may know about this case, Taylor. Charles something. Anyway, he was autopsied after I think he got the death penalty. They autopsied him, and they found a huge brain tumor on his amygdala or something. And this is probably why you snapped and started shooting people. And so, so from the spectrum of that, obvious, like that would be the thing that you said was an outside source not allowing you to, you know, or you could have a super being stopping you or whatever. To it's just the chemistry of your brain and your body. I mean, it seems like there's always going to be some force acting on you. How can one have agency?
Yeah, that's good. So the last part of the question about how could we have agency at all is a little bit separate, but it's related. But I think maybe it's worth just focusing on the first part about how we could really be free or responsible for what we do if we couldn't do otherwise. And you're right; those kinds of cases, assuming that that is what's going on in cases where someone has a brain tumor or something else going on that makes them act out of character, it looks like they're not doing what they would want to be doing. This is tricky when what's going on is something that's internal to their own body. But in any case, I do want to say about those cases that the person's not blameworthy for the wrongdoing. So how could it be that I could say that about that case, but I could also say, well, you could be responsible even if you couldn't have done otherwise. Here's a different kind of case. They're sometimes called Frankfurt cases after the philosopher Harry Frankfurt, who made these kinds of cases very popular in a 1969 paper. Imagine, let's go back to my example of Bill asking me to be on the podcast. Suppose that that Drew really wanted me to say yes to be on the podcast, and he was willing to do some heavy duty intervening to make sure that I said yes. So what he did was the night before I got together with Bill, Drew secretly implanted a chip in my brain that gave him the power to force me to decide to say yes to being on the podcast. And he's also got this device that lets him monitor my deliberative activity. So, the next day after Drew's implanted this device in my brain, he's like watching how I'm thinking, and he's going to see if I'm inclined to say yes or inclined to say no to be on the podcast. But Drew, even though he's okay with intervening to put the chip in my brain, he doesn't really want to force me to say yes. He wants me to do it on my own. And so he's just watching. And, as Bill asked the question, hey, will you be on the podcast? I'm just about to say yes. Drew can see, it looks like he's about to say yes. And so Drew doesn't actually press his button. He doesn't intervene to force me to choose. In that kind of case.
But I would have if you had said
yes,
no, if you were
yes.
going to say no.
That's right. If there was any sign that I was going to decline, you would have forced me to agree. So in that case, there's a lot of controversies about these Frankfurt cases, but it looks like what happens is the person, me in this case, does something that they couldn't have avoided doing, namely, in this case, agree to be on the podcast. And yet, because this counterfactual intervener, Drew in this case, doesn't actually intervene to force me to say yes, it looks like I'm responsible for saying yes. It was really my choice, and you could hold me accountable for it. Maybe say thank you. That would be a way of sort of expressing gratitude, praising me for the agreement. So those kinds of cases seem to call into question the idea that you'd have to have leeway, freedom to be morally responsible for what you do. And
well, yeah, of course, if you had been wanting to say no and I had flipped the switch and you had said yes, then you wouldn't have been responsible. So it kind of, I guess the point to me is you're still making a choice, and that intent matters. You just don't actually have the ability to carry it out.
Yeah, that's good. You're anticipating a lot of the subtleties of the discussion of Frankfurt cases after his paper. Yeah, so we could make it
I did do a little bit of reading in the last week. I will admit that.
Nice. Yeah. So nowadays, the thing in question, the action in question in a Frankfurt case won't be the overt action of me expressing agreement to be on the podcast, like saying yes. Instead, it's the decision itself. And so in this case, if we modified it, Drew, you'd be ready to intervene to force me to decide to be on the podcast, if I showed any sign that I was going to decide otherwise. But as it happens, I decided to be on the podcast without your intervention, and it looks like I'm morally responsible for that decision. So there, we're trying to avoid this issue of you have freedom to make a different decision. It's just whether you can carry it out or not. In the modified case, the idea is supposed to be, well, it looks like you couldn't have made another decision, right? It could have been that you were forced to make the decision, but it still would have been the same decision. And yet it looks like you're morally responsible.
So your part about sourcehood, then, if I understand this, is that if you can establish there's an I, then I'm free. It sounds sort of like, if I had to summarize it very concisely, if we can establish there's an I, then the I is free. But I think the average person is going to say, well, that's only going to be considered free. Their will is free if this I really does have options. In other words, if there is this kind of leeway element to it, if there's not the leeway element to it, it really doesn't matter that there's an I if the I is always only sort of fated, determined, whatever you want to say, destined to do sort of one thing. I think that's how the average person would respond to that. So what do you say to that?
Yeah. I think the leeway view of freedom is very attractive to a lot of people. It's hard to know, like among philosophers, or even just among the philosophers who work on free will, like what the majority think. But I would guess that the leeway view is the more attractive view, even among those groups.
Wouldn't you think, Taylor, wouldn't you say it's not, when you say it's attractive, I would say that for most people, they would sort of think it's not that the word free doesn't even really mean what they've understood it to mean if it didn't include that. It's not even just about attraction. It's just sort of like they would just call it something else. They wouldn't use the word. Yeah,
I think that's right too. Although this gets into like debates about how to use the terminology, and those debates get very messy, hard to adjudicate. Like one famous philosopher who works on free will, Peter Van Inwagen, says there is no such thing as like free will out there in the world. He just uses the term free will as a term of art to refer to really this leeway power. So it gets messy. But anyway, I think it's, even if, they're right that there is this there's this way of using the term free that picks out leeway. There's also a way of using the term that's part of our ordinary language that picks out the sourcehood conception of freedom. Like, that wasn't really me, or, someone else made me do it. Like, maybe that's connected up with the leeway idea, but it also seems to be really, homing in on this sourcehood idea.
Do you think it's been like actually demonstrated that there's a, like, for example, I think of human beings as being both material and immaterial. And so there's never been a debate, as far as I can see in Christian history, among Christian thinkers, whether there's material causes to what we do. There's obviously physical causes to why we choose to do things that play a big role in what we end up doing. And the I bit for me is immaterial, and it is freer. I'm tending to view freedom more in the leeway sense, but I don't really deny the way you talked about sourcehood. But do you feel like there's like a very clear demonstrative case of sort of the Jeffrey Dahmer? I mean, Drew, you cited one, but I guess I would still say, are we really that certain scientifically that that's what explains what the guy did that day? And do you think, Taylor, like when it comes to the sort of the Jeffrey Dahmers of the world, that in real practical terms, like, we shouldn't be imprisoning people like this. We should be putting them in safe research contexts, and so they don't cannibalize the researchers, and they're studied, and I think you'll agree with me, there are definitely people who are totally committed right now to the belief that if we could gain enough knowledge, we could tweak the environment in such a way that we completely change their behavior, their conduct, and it would be foolproof, right? So do you think that's true? Or is that do you think that that's a philosophical commitment they have, or has that really been shown to be true?
Those are all great questions. I'm not really sure what to say about that last bit. I mean, I think it is an open empirical question whether we could, just by tweaking circumstances, and even by tweaking a person's brain as well as the circumstances, whether we could really predict everything that they would do, or make it certain that they would avoid certain behaviors. But so I think that's sort of an open question. There probably are philosophical commitments had by people speculating about that. But about the types of people who seem to not only lack leeway, but also seem not responsible, right? On my view, the way of making sense of that is to say, well, in a case where, like, you know, a person would have acted differently were it not for the brain tumor, the reason they're doing the immoral behavior, say, let's just call it immoral, the crime, right? The reason they're doing the bad stuff is because of the brain tumor, right? They're doing that because they couldn't have done otherwise,
You're
even though they
separating
wanted
the
to.
cause from their person and the brain tumor in this case. And, you know, what I'm saying is, to do that, you have to prove that there is a their person, you know, or you have to have the belief, at least, that there is a their person. And I guess that's kind of one thing that we're talking about when we're asking about whether we can be blameworthy, praiseworthy, culpable. Is there a we? Is there an I who can act? You know,
For the even for the how about for even for the strict materialist? If you're a
Right.
strict materialist, do you think there can also be the we?
Yeah, I mean, what I think is debates about what we are. I think we're using the term we. There is such a thing as you. There is such a thing as me. Now, what exactly that picks out, whether it's just, you know, an entirely material thing, or that plus an immaterial soul, or something else. Anyway, I think that's an interesting debate, but I think it's orthogonal to the free will debate. Like, it doesn't really bear on the free will debate, because I think if you're suppose that it turns out we're completely material beings, I think you can still give an account of control, and the control that's necessary for responsibility, even in terms of you know, material states and events. So yeah, I guess I have a view on that. Like, I probably am closer to your view, Bill. I don't know exactly what view in the philosophy of mind I hold, but I don't think that we're entirely material beings, or that you can give a completely material account of human beings. But the reason that I don't, you know, do a whole lot of work on this or read a whole lot on it is because I think it's ultimately not going to bear on the free will issue.
All right.
Look, if I can go back to just one thing. So if we go back to my case of my version of a Frankfurt case, where I say yes to being on the podcast, or I make the decision to be on the podcast, and I couldn't have done otherwise. The reason I think I'm still responsible in that case, despite lacking alternatives, is I think the fact that I didn't have an alternative didn't explain why I made the decision, or why I acted as I did. So the explanation's all in terms of me and what I wanted to do and that sort of thing. In a case where someone is acting out of character because of a brain tumor, I think they're performing those actions because they couldn't have done otherwise, and that's why they're exculpated. So even though I have the source of view, and I think leeway is not what's needed for freedom, I think there's a way of distinguishing between responsible and non-responsible agents. Even though they both lack alternatives, right? That's not what's taking away freedom. It doesn't take away freedom in one of the cases, right? I think it has to do with the explanation.
And so you don't even have to really posit a brain tumor here. You can just say, in the other case of the Frankfurt experiment, where you were going to say no and I prevented you, that was like a brain tumor. That was an external cause that wasn't you causing it. You were inclined to act one way and something acted upon you. And I don't see personally how that's different from your own body chemistry acting against you and causing you to have a mood swing that makes you act in a way that, you know, is not how you would want to act. How is that a part of you any more than the brain tumor?
Yeah, right. That's good. Yeah, I guess it does depend. I mean, different people in my camp in the free will debate will take different views on what the agent is. There's some views that I don't think they would choose this label, but it's come to be known as the real self view, where there's the real you, and then there's these other, you know, things that are internal to your body. Maybe they're even part of your deliberation at some point, but they're like external to the real you. And yeah, maybe if those things take over, then that does exculpate in just the way that external factors, like the counterfactual intervener does.
It kind of feels like that, by the way, that there's I mean, the old you know, Animal House scene with the little John Belushi? They had the little angel and the demon, you know, sort of on your shoulder. I mean, it does sort of feel that way, that there's this sort of spectator on myself within me, you know, that's observing me.
Yeah,
Kind of sounds like what the Apostle Paul said at some points, you know,
Yeah.
like what I want to do, I do not do, and what I hate, I do. And if I agree that the law is good, and blah 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 blah, it's just like it does seem like what took me over sometimes. I think everybody said that. Like, what made me do that? You know,
End of the podcast. The Apostle Paul was true. Drew made that great last point. Let's just close out right there.
Yeah, I think it's in movies too. If you think of like apology scenes in rom-coms, often the kinds of things that go into the apology, whether they should or not, are things like, that wasn't really what I wanted to do, or like, that wasn't really me, that sort of thing. So yeah. I don't know that I really like this idea that, yeah, there's some of your desires that are really yours and others of your desires that aren't. Well, I think Paul was right, but how exactly to understand the Apostle Paul is tricky. I do think we have competing desires, and Frankfurt himself thought that you can't really fully understand us, but persons. I mean, he really thought you can give an account of personhood in terms of not only having desires to act in particular ways, but desires about those desires. So like I desire that my desire to have a second piece of cake after dinner not be effective. Right? I want to say no to the extra piece of cake. But yet, on the other hand, sometimes I have another of these higher order desires that competes with that. So like other times I also want to eat the extra piece of cake. So I think, yeah, getting into these explanations of our behavior it gets complicated very quickly. You have to do quite a bit of moral psychology, but that's really, on my view, that's where to look for an account of freedom. It's not going to be in terms of leeway or alternative possibilities.
I think there's the other side of this, which we haven't really factored in, but I know it's a part of it, is whether the external cause, whatever is external, if it's a cause, is it an all-sufficient cause? Right? Could a tumor have a massive influence on the kinds of choices I might make, but not necessarily explain the whole show? That's another huge part of the, I think for most people, if it explains the whole show, then they're not free. Was usually the way.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. That's why I say I can't really differentiate that from just some. I said body chemistry before, but let me broaden that. I mean, certainly, like, we're not free to do anything that our intelligence limits us from. We're not. If I want to, my skills come into play. If I want to beat you up, Bill, and you just beat me up, then I wasn't free to win that fight.
Yeah.
Present environment, past experiences, all these things,
DNA,
sort of, they not only become a part of who we are, much like the brain tumor did, but they are a cause in some sense of who we are. I mean, we can't not allow things to cause us to be the way we are. We don't have the freedom to do that.
Drew, would you then be committed enough to say, yes, really, we shouldn't have prisons, we should have just high-tech research labs? I
would say that if we had the ability, which I'm with Taylor, I don't know that I think that's theoretical, but yeah, if we had the ability to do that, I think rehabilitation is a lot more interesting than punishment.
Well, yeah. It sounds, by the way, I think there's nobody, if it were really true, that wouldn't say, hey, that sounds like a good option, Right. The problem is that
I think it's theoretically possible?
I think, that's barely I was thinking more what your level of commitment was, because
I'm not committed to the fact that it's possible, because I just don't. Yeah. I don't have that. I think that's a scientific question, honestly. But I am philosophically committed to the idea that if it is, it's definitely the way to go, and that it does seem to me that there are. I think the limitation to that, quite frankly, would be there are some things that are part of us that we didn't cause, that we want to remain a part of us, and we don't want to take a pill to remove that part of us, even if there's a chance that it could lead us down a bad path. And so it's kind of like, I mean, Taylor, maybe you can help me flesh this out, but is it to some extent necessarily all the things that I've said, and it's a feedback loop, and there's some freedom in there, but clearly I think all three of us would say, well, there are some things that we didn't choose. We didn't choose our, and we never can completely author ourselves. And Taylor said this a long time ago when he mentioned the spectrum. We didn't cause ourselves. So Can you help me flesh that out? Am I sort of on the right path there?
Definitely on the right path. I think sometimes the label for this set of questions is moral luck. So like, yeah, it's a matter of luck for me, what kind of constitution I had when I started off as a little agent, like what kinds of preferences, desires, even to some extent beliefs. I mean, you know, a lot depends on the way you're raised, your context, and a lot depends on nature too, you know, to use the terms of nature and nurture. And that's completely outside of our control. Like just I think of that as a necessary truth, right? For agents, at the very least, for agents like us who come into existence, it's just not possible for us to have chosen what we'd be like. Now, so a lot of people think, well, it follows from that responsibility never gets off the ground because it's luck all the way down or luck through and through. My view is that luck mitigates responsibility. So one thing I'm committed to is that responsibility comes in degrees. So to go back to Bill's question about a brain tumor that's, you know, a strong influence, but not sort of full cause of someone's doing something, I'm inclined to give a sort of degreed account of what's going on there, that their control, the person's control is mitigated and their responsibility is too. What I think about luck, especially what you might call constitutive luck, is that over time we can come to reflect on our preferences, our desires, our character traits. And even though you can't just choose your character out of nothing or without any kind of influencing factor, if you have the capacity that we typical human beings do to reflect on, you know, what you care about, and then to, whether it's directly or more likely indirectly, influence what your character's like down the line by, you know, cultivating certain habits, fighting certain others. I think our constitutive luck itself gets mitigated over time, that we start to shape what we're like. Now, of course, I think because that starts off in a place of complete luck, it's not like you're creating yourself out of nothing or anything like that. I just think that's how responsibility gets off the ground, is that you get a little bit of control over what you're like, you get a little bit of responsibility in there, and then as time progresses and you make more choices that influence what you're like, your degree of responsibility can increase too.
So as a Christian, I guess when you're using terms like moral luck, these are terms of trade rather than the way you see the whole framework. Is that correct?
Yeah, I guess that's right. So okay. It's very complicated to fit that all together with, you know, the traditional Christian theological terms, but I think there is a way to do it.
Sure.
You know, people in my tradition of, you know, broadly Reformed tradition tend not to like talking about luck at all because that seems to imply that it was a matter of chance and like God hadn't, you know, foreseen it or decreed it. So yeah, setting all that aside, using the terms of the trade, I think.
Well, certainly luck does a pretty good job of talking of encompassing all the things that I was trying to talk about. You know, the past experiences, the innate tendencies and intelligence, blah 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 blah.
Right.
And you know, I think we've kind of stumbled upon the divide here, Bill. I really do feel, I'll give Sam Harris credit for this phrase, but I do kind of think it's luck all the way down. You know, and even like as Taylor was saying, his way of looking at it is that we come alongside the path that we're on, and we make decisions about how we're going to feed back into to the making of ourselves. And I would say that even our tendency to do that is not caused by us, and so in some way it's not really our decision to, you know, if I work hard on you know, studying up for the podcast so that it'll be a good conversation this week, I wasn't entirely causing myself to do that work. I did that because that's what I'm interested in and I'm curious about it. So I think, you know, for me it's really hard to find a spot where I become anything that was caused by me. So I'll kick it to you, Bill, to give the last word, but I think for me that's the divide.
Yeah, I think it may be a little bit of a trivide in that I find first of all, let me speak for the average listener and say, to the degree I understood anything that was being talked about today, I think I lean on the leeway side of the idea of free will. And so I found it really refreshing and helpful to hear Taylor's sort of take, and it's got me really stimulated to think more about that. And I do have one, so I do think you're right, basically, Drew, about that. And I do want one kind of final quick question for Taylor, which is, it doesn't need to be long, but I think when I read this article in The Atlantic, which is, for those interested, by the way, the title of the article was "There's No Such Thing as Free Will, but We're Better Off Believing It Anyway," if you want to go read it. But one of the things,
paradoxical title there.
Yeah, one of the things
Don't
I
believe
didn't.
me.
Yeah. One of the things I didn't like was that I feel like as I see this all the time, it assumes that really it's only recent, and it's only because of science that anybody has really been able to think clearly about free will. As if none of the classical philosophers, the Christian philosophers through history, really had anything to contribute until.
No one's ever thought of this.
But since Darwin, we now all know the truth. So it's just a quick question: is that the case?
I do think there are new worries in light of new science, but yes, often especially in popular media, the problem gets presented as a completely new problem. But even this divide between people who think freedom's a matter of leeway, freedom's a matter of sourcehood, you can trace that back probably further, but at least to the Epicureans and the Stoics, who had those competing views respectively. So no, not a new thing. There are lots of different threats to free will, and at different times in history, what is the sort of main topic of conversation, especially among philosophers, can change. So, a lot of it had to do with worries about God and God's foreknowledge in the ancient and medieval period. With the rise of Newtonian science, there was a discussion of causal determinism and physical determinism that became really influential on shaping the contemporary terms that we use and positions in the debate. With Darwin, and nature and nurture took a slightly different direction. Now I think you can think of the scientific threats to free will now. The really sort of big ones, the hot topics, is coming from psychology and from neuroscience. And if I can plug my podcast, The Free Will Show, that I co-host with my friend Matt Flummer, we're planning to do a whole season of the podcast, a set of probably 10 episodes or so, just on issues in free will and science. We'll have scientists and philosophers on as guests, and we'll talk about neuroscience, psychology, some physics too. So people who are interested in really diving deeper can check that out. The first couple of seasons of our podcast were meant to be very introductory. So mostly we interview philosophers about issues on free will and determinism, but we introduce theological questions too, and scientific ones. So yeah, people can check that out. You
really
can find
interested to hear this season, philosophers talking to scientists, this should be great.
What's the name of it again? One more time.
It's called The Free Will Show. You can find it anywhere. And we have a website, thefreewillshow.com, but you can find it on Apple or Spotify or what have you.
Awesome. Taylor, thanks so much for being with us today.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This has been great.
Yeah, great. Well, I'm Bill the Christian.
And I'm Drew the Skeptic. Thanks for listening.
The Divide is produced by Alan and Ben Hawbrooks and edited by John Workman. Dalton Reed handles IT. Join us for further discussion on this topic at our subreddit, TheDividebyiPUB. To learn more about other episodes and who we are, check out ipub.org/thedivide. See you next time on The Divide.